Welcome back to Unintended Consequences, Episode 4. We're looking at a case today where the people involved were doing their best with the information they had. In the winter of 1943 to 1944, U.S. Army typhus control teams in Naples pumped handheld sprayers filled with a 10% DDT solution over the heads and clothing of more than 1 million refugees and soldiers. Within weeks, the epidemic collapsed. The compound that had been synthesized only 4 years earlier was hailed as a public health triumph. Yet 2 decades later, field biologists in the northeastern United States were cracking open eggs from eyries that contained no viable embryos. The shells were so thin they collapsed under the weight of incubating parents. The substance designed to sever the transmission of malaria and typhus had entered the fatty tissues of fish and birds, concentrating at each step up the food chain until it reached the top predators whose reproductive failure no one had modeled. The Swiss chemist Paul Hermann Müller, working at the J.R. Geigy laboratories in Basel, first demonstrated DDT's insecticidal power in 1939 while screening compounds for moth-proofing wool. At the time, insect vectors still killed or disabled millions each year. Louse-borne typhus had devastated armies in the First World War and was again threatening civilian populations displaced by the Second. Müller's compound was inexpensive to manufacture. It appeared to have low acute toxicity to mammals. It remained effective for weeks after a single application. Public health authorities therefore saw it as a rational weapon against an ancient enemy. When the U.S. military adopted it for delousing and mosquito control in the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters, the results were immediate and measurable. Typhus cases in sprayed Italian cities fell from thousands to near zero. In that context, extending the same tool to agriculture after 1945 seemed a logical next step for protecting food supplies for a world still recovering from wartime shortages. Between 1945 and 1955, U.S. production of DDT rose from roughly 10 million pounds to more than 100 million pounds annually. Much of it was applied to cotton, potatoes, and forests. The World Health Organization launched its Global Malaria Eradication Program in 1955, relying on indoor residual spraying of DDT at 1 to 2 grams per square meter. Early results were dramatic. Sri Lanka reported only 17 malaria cases in 1963 after spraying began, down from 2.8 million in 1946. American newspapers and government films carried slogans such as DDT is good for me, while the U.S. Department of Agriculture conducted aerial campaigns against gypsy moths in the Northeast and fire ants in the South. A handful of entomologists noted the rapid appearance of resistant houseflies in Italy by 1947. They warned that mosquitoes might follow. Yet these cautions were treated as engineering problems solvable by higher doses or rotation of compounds. At the time, no regulatory framework required testing for long-term ecological persistence or effects on non-target species. DDT is highly lipophilic and degrades slowly in the environment. Its metabolite, DD, interferes with calcium deposition during eggshell formation in birds of prey. By the early 1960s, eggshell thickness in peregrine falcons in Britain had declined by approximately 20%. Nesting success in the eastern United States had fallen below replacement levels. In Clear Lake, California, a 1949 to 1957 gnat control program applied 40,000 pounds of DDT, a close relative. After that program, western grebe populations crashed. Tissue samples showed concentrations 80,000 times higher than in the surrounding water. The same pattern appeared in estuaries and forests wherever repeated spraying occurred. Plankton absorbed trace amounts, fish concentrated them, fish-eating birds received doses high enough to disrupt reproduction. human breast milk samples collected in the United States and Western Europe during the 1960s routinely contained measurable DDT residues. The health consequences remained uncertain because the compound persisted for years. Each new application added to an accumulating burden rather than replacing an earlier one. Resistance in target insects then prompted still heavier use, accelerating the cycle. The second order effect was the loss of natural predators that had previously helped control agricultural pests. The third order effect was a broad public awakening to the possibility that synthetic chemicals could reorganize entire ecosystems in ways invisible at the point of application. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, serialized in The New Yorker in June 1962 and published as a book that September, synthesized these field observations and forced the issue into national debate. President Kennedy directed the Science Advisory Committee to review the evidence. Its 1963 report confirmed the hazards to wildlife and called for tighter controls. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, newly created in 1970, held formal hearings and in 1972 banned DDT from most agricultural uses while allowing continued public health applications. In some regions where spraying ceased abruptly, malaria incidents rose again. Sri Lanka recorded a resurgence to more than 500,000 cases by 1969. The meta-irony emerged decades later when the World Health Organization, facing persistent malaria mortality in sub-Saharan Africa, endorsed limited indoor DDT spraying again in 2006 after newer insecticides proved less durable on mud walls. Today, DDT remains detectable in Arctic food webs and in human serum worldwide, even though its legal agricultural use has ended in most countries. The compound's environmental half-life has proven far longer than the institutions that first deployed it. Once a persistent, fat-soluble molecule is released into living systems, its movement through food webs and its cumulative dose cannot be predicted from short-term toxicity tests alone. Decision makers therefore need monitoring protocols that track second and third order ecological changes rather than relying solely on the original target organism. At the same time, the urgency of controlling disease vectors remains real. The question is not whether to intervene, but how to design interventions whose side effects can be detected and corrected before they scale. The DDT story continues to surface whenever new classes of pesticides, plastics, or pharmaceuticals are introduced at industrial volumes. The same tension between immediate, measurable benefits and diffuse, delayed consequences reappears. How might we build regulatory and scientific institutions that treat ecological persistence as a design criterion rather than an after-the-fact surprise? That's unintended consequences for today. If this episode gave you something to think about, share it with a friend who'd appreciate the story. Subscribe wherever you listen, and we'll be back tomorrow with another case. This podcast is curated by Patrick, but generated using AI voice synthesis of my voice. The primary reason to do this is I unfortunately don't have the time to be consistent with generating all the content and wanted to focus on creating consistent and regular episodes for all the themes that I enjoy, and I hope others do as well.